one of the things that whatever side you take that you can agree on is having better data and information that can help us to understand the extent of problems that are occurring and what the appropriate corrective measures might be is important and valuable. We can all agree on that. To that end, our next profile in innovation is one which highlights, I think, a very innovative effort by one of our own faculty here at Penn, my colleague Charles Loeffler, who's over in our criminology department. He's put together, I think, a fascinating and in many ways groundbreaking effort to try and understand and measure the extent of the problem of wrongful convictions. So we're very pleased to have Charles here to tell us some about the work that he's done in that area as our next Profiles in Innovation talk.
So I want to thank the Quattrone Center for the invitation to share a bit of work that I've been doing over the last year and a half with a colleague of mine, former student, now over at Drexel. So I'd like to motivate this talk by posing the following question to the room. What % of prisoners are wrongfully convicted? What do you think? 30%, 40%,
4%.
4%, okay. Other answers?
1 to 7.
1 to 7?
20%?
20%? So we have a bit of a range. And in reality, we don't have an answer for this question yet. It seems like we should have an answer for this question, but it's not for want of effort. We've been trying to answer a version of this question for really almost 100 years. We've had scholars going all the way back to scholars working at Yale Law School in actually even before the 1930s, the 1910s, trying to collect cases in which individuals were exonerated and found in other cases to be innocent, and to compile these and use those cases as a way of understanding something about the frequency of wrongful convictions, as well as something about the predictors and causes of wrongful convictions as well. Now, despite that long effort, we still haven't been fully successful in answering this question. In recent years, we've made particular progress in a subset of wrongful convictions. And those are wrongful convictions that are generated within the subset of cases involving usually capital murder as well as rape. And within this subset of cases, we've been successful in identifying a wrongful conviction rate somewhere in the vicinity of 3 to 4% as our best estimate, and with a surprising degree of agreement between a variety of methodologies and samples of cases. Now, at one level you could say, all right, we know it's 4%. He said it, it's 4%. I read those articles long ago, it's 4%. Why do we need to focus on this question again? And part of the reason is because that population of cases, capital cases, represents less than 1% of all convictions and all prison cases generated each year. And not only that, that's actually a shrinking percentage. As in the United States, we reduce our use of the death penalty, the number of cases in that population is getting smaller, and the relative size of all other convictions, many ending in imprisonment, but also terms of probation, is expanding. So we not only have a dark figure for the number of wrongful convictions in this larger part of the distribution, but that's actually an expanding dark figure. Now, we might be willing to say, all right, that might be true, but we think the lessons learned from the capital case literature, they tell us enough. We can use those to infer frequencies and causes within this larger distribution. And that might be right. But again, we don't know. So this is where the Criminal Justice Experience Survey comes in. There are lots of different methodologies we could be using to study wrongful convictions. But a problem of generalizability is that the methods that we use to identify wrongful convictions in the capital case literature is not available to us in the broader population of non-capital cases. DNA may not be present, all sorts of other, the gathering of alibi witnesses, all these things that we come to rely on to make sense and to generate cases of wrongful convictions within that literature is not available to us. So my colleagues and I decided, why don't we just try a different approach? Why don't we just ask the prisoners themselves how often they've been wrongfully convicted and use that as a basis for figuring out the rate of wrongful conviction and for then figuring out the predictors and causes of wrongful convictions in this larger distribution. Now, this isn't the first time we've tried to think of other ways of measuring wrongful convictions. There's been efforts to survey criminal justice practitioners. There's been efforts to do judge-jury agreement studies. But in each of these cases, we're relying on the fact that someone's true innocence or guilt, that knowledge of that is available to a legal practitioner. And that's an assumption that we can't always make in all cases. So we said, why don't we try and surveying prisoners and see what happens when we do that? So about a year and a half ago, we developed a relatively short 10-part study asking individuals about their conviction process, the legal process more generally, as well as some background, case, and demographic characteristics. We went to a reception facility for the state of Pennsylvania. That's where most prisoners go prior to being sent to their longer stay facilities. And we administered this survey literally within 3 to 4 hours of their arriving at the facility. This is the first piece of paperwork that they completed, and they did that in a group setting. And we wanted it in a group setting in order to reinforce our promise of anonymity to the participants. We could have given it to them and said, oh, I'll take this back to your cell and bring it back later. That would have reduced the response rate. That also would have reduced the promise of anonymity. We had a very high response rate, 94%. And we got essentially over 2,600 responses over a 5-month period. So this is what they told us. The first question we asked was, so do you think you were wrongfully convicted? Over 2/3, 68%, said, no, we're good with our convictions. That left about 32% that said, no, we were wrongfully convicted. Now, we didn't stop there, because it's not clear what that means exactly. There's lots of things that can go wrong with the case, and lots of things that could cause someone to say, I was wrongfully convicted. So then we asked, what exactly do you mean when you say that you were wrongfully convicted? And this is what they said. About 4% in that other reason category said, I didn't like my lawyer, I didn't like the judge, police officer did something wrong. Yeah, but I did it. Another 2% said, yeah, I did what I was convicted of, but it was a weak case. Another 2% said, yeah, I did what I was convicted of, but I was actually less involved than the prosecution claimed. Another 2% said, I did what I was convicted of, but I didn't mean to do it. I lacked full intent, at least as I understand intent. But the largest category was 9% that said, I didn't do everything I was convicted of. And that could mean different things. Some people said, yes, I trespassed, but I didn't steal anything, and I was convicted of burglary. Or yes, I did an armed robbery, but I didn't have a gun, and they put a gun charge on me. So you have about 9% saying I didn't do everything I was convicted of. And that left 8% that said, no, I just didn't do anything at all. I wasn't involved. So some of you are looking at that number and saying, it's too high, the number's definitely lower than that. Some of you are looking at that number and saying, you know, actually it's too low. You've ruled out all of these things that were incorrect. And some of you are saying, well, you know, maybe it's about right. I'm not sure. Well, we weren't exactly sure either. And so we wanted to think a little bit harder about what that 8% actually meant. And we were aided in this by the fact that although it's pretty hard to know when someone is asked a question, did you do something, yes or no, and they say no, what that means, a lot of our sample actually had a lot more experience with the criminal justice system in practice. So of those roughly 2,600 people, they had between them approximately 6,500 convictions. That's prior convictions, not including the 2,600 that put them in prison and into our sample. So we said, gee, this seems like an opportunity. And this reminds us of Statistics 101, that class that some of you took and some of you definitely did not take in college. Because this actually is something a bit like the binomial distribution. We have a probability of the criminal justice system generating a correct conviction. We hope that's high. We have a probability of the criminal justice system generating a wrongful conviction. Hopefully that's quite low. And we can use the binomial distribution in looking over people's complete criminal histories to understand the likelihood or plausibility of the different responses that we see from our respondents. So if we take this example at the bottom of the slide, let's assume for the sake of argument that the probability of the justice system getting it right is 0.9. And alternatively, the probability of it getting it wrong is 0.1. Now, if we have one justice system in all jurisdictions for all people, for all cases, that's sort of the scenario we're looking at. And we're positing here that it's a 0.9 to 0.1 split. So now if an individual has 3 convictions, and he reports all of them were good, there's a pretty high probability of that being true. That's about 0.73, 3/4. We feel pretty good about that statement. Someone else says, well, 2 out of 3 were right. Well, that's possible. That's about 24%. Still possible. 1 out of 3. That's getting a little less likely. That's about 3% chance. And the odds that someone had 3 prior convictions and they were all wrong, as they report, the odds of that are just going to be 0.1 cubed. So 1 in 1,000. Pretty small odds. So we generalize this basic idea that we learn about in introductory probability into a method for understanding and looking at the data from all of these folks in our sample. And that's what you see here. And what you see in this graph, starting at the far right, is that more than half of our sample experienced a justice system in which the justice system almost always gets it right. It's over 0.99. And that doesn't matter how many convictions they have. 1 conviction, 3 convictions, 5 convictions, 10 convictions. They report all of them were good. The second bump you see is from about 42% of our sample. They report a justice system that gets it right most of the time, about 0.7. That's their experience. Essentially, almost 3 out of 4 convictions are right in their experience. And then we have the last group in our data. This is the group, about 2% of our sample, that no matter how many wrongful convictions or convictions they have, they say they're all wrong. Whether that's 1, whether that's 2, whether that's 10. It's possible that that's their experience, and for some of them that probably is. It's also true that this is also a very low probability event for these individuals. So this is our estimate of the fraction of our sample that is giving implausible responses from their experience. So now if we return to our main graph here, we went from about 32% to 8%. And with this correction, we think that the rate of factual innocence in our sample, as self-reported by prisoners in this sample, is about 6%. That's our best estimate in this sample. Now we could stop there and say, great, we have a number, it's useful, we didn't know it before, it'd be interesting to see what it looks like in other places, perhaps in other times. But there's more that we can do once we have an infrastructure that allows us to measure this phenomena in a wide variety of settings, in a wide variety of populations. We can begin by understanding how different legal processes relate to this outcome. So what you see here is the mode of trial and the wrongful conviction rate. So most of our sample has been found guilty by a plea. That's what we see in the left. About 2,400 have been, well, about that. But the key thing here is that most of these self-reported guilty plea prisoners do report themselves to be guilty. But about half, a little less than half, of our wrongful convictions in our sample are generated in plea cases. A little more than half, it's not statistically significant, come from trials. That's what we see in that second bar chart. It's about split half and half. So we begin to understand that we have two sort of contributing problems. We have the plea leading to wrongful convictions. We have the trials as well. And then we can start to look by other factors, like the most serious conviction offense. And that's what you see here. We see some offenses, particularly low count offenses like forgery, as well as even car theft, as well as possession with intent to distribute, having very low probabilities of a wrongful conviction, on the order of less than 5%, 2% in some cases. At the extreme, we have some of our more serious offenses, including rape, murder, going into the double digits of people self-reporting wrongful convictions in these cases. And we have a wide variety in practice, most clustering at around that 6 to 8% number, but with a few outliers. We can do something similar, not just for offenses like this, offense types, but we can begin to look at trial counsel. We're looking now at county by county variation in the probability of people self-reporting wrongful convictions within Pennsylvania. And we're also starting to understand a little bit more about how the factors that we have seen to matter so much in the capital case literature do and do not work to explain the wrongful convictions as measured by this survey in the non-capital case domain. Some of those factors work very well. Some of them are less impactful in practice. And so in the work that we're doing, we're trying to understand whether we have all the information that we need, and also whether tools like this can be deployed in a range of different settings. Prisons are a particular setting. As strange as it may seem, they are a particularly good setting to administer surveys in. But what about all the other cases out there? The folks who experience a non-custodial sentence after a quick plea. How do we understand their experience? And what can their experience tell us about the different theories of why wrongful convictions happen? So with that, I think I'll close. I want to thank you for listening to this, as well as if you're interested in seeing more of the work, I put my email up on the slide, as well as my co-author on the project. And thank you.